Hi friends, so we are going to make a woolly petals goose today. This is the one that we will be making in the video today, and so I just wanted to show you. We have a fun goose with some tail feathers that stick up. You have optional wings where you can tuck a little label underneath. We have feet attached to legs on this one. You can also do only feet without the legs, which is shown right here. Either option is fine. We have eyes that can be sewn on at different parts in the pattern. The pattern explains that, and I'll walk you through that in the video. And yeah, this is just me making this goose and walking you through each step with you so that you have a little bit better understanding of how to make the goose. Since it is a three-dimensional object, it's a little bit different than sewing like a flat quilt block. And I hope you have fun making the goose, and please share, tag me on social media when you share it. I would love to see your makes. So let's get into the process. So I'm going to walk you through every step of the way, and you will make a goose at the end. There are a couple different modifications you can do. Like I said, you could have the wings on or have them off. Either way, it's very cute with or without. Shortening the legs by not adding the leg piece, just having the foot piece. I have also made this with a vinyl beak, and that I will explain how to do as well, because it's sewn basically the same, but you omit one step. So first, what you are going to need for your geese is your fabrics. So you have a main body fabric. Any color is fine. I have clearly stayed towards some of the lighter colors. White, cream. Quilting cotton is great. You do not have to line this, but you could. If you would prefer to line it, you can use SF 101. And I've lined a couple of them, but I haven't actually lined quilting cotton except for a pieced goose. So let me grab that for a second. So these are a couple other geese I have made. This is a boucle fabric. So this is a little bit different pattern than what I ended up with. Some of these are patterns that is no longer available by somebody else, and some of these are patterns that were during my testing phase. So this is a patchwork one, and I did SF 101 this one just to keep all of the seams more flat and in shape. And it is very cute, but it is a little bit trickier because you're trying to make sure those seams don't bust where you're cutting out the pattern. This is one that I did use SF 101. It's a minky. It's a very lightweight drapey minky. Maybe you can tell by the wing, just kind of goes. So I did SF 101 this because I was worried about the neck being too floppy. And I have worked through that by making sure you just stuff the neck very well with your stuffing. And then this one is a boucle fabric, like I said. So it's a little bit heavier weight. It's usually used for upholstery. So it is nice, has a nice woven thick backing to the more soft fuzzy top. And that one does not need SF 101. But I just thought I would bring those over to show a couple different fabric options. But quilting cotton is a lot of fun, and I know a lot of you have maybe come over from Instagram are quilters. So I'm using new fabric from Lizzie House Love Letter for Moda. I'm going to use this for the wing. So there is an option you can do for the wing. You can make it two-sided with the body fabric on the back and a decorative fabric on the front, or you can make it with the same fabric on either side. If you do the legs, you can match that to the wing, or I like to often use, if my wing, this wing just ended up being a lighter color, so I was fine with it. But if I do legs, I often use just a creamy, natural, plain fabric that coordinates nicely with my main body fabric. Then you will need two, if you desire, you could just use one, orange fabrics. I like to have a different beak fabric than the feet. So I just kind of coordinate them. You just want to keep your prints complementary, but not, like, I wouldn't probably do two florals. You can see on here I have a plaid and a floral, and this guy I have stars, and these are little like pins. So a little bit geometric, a little bit natural, a little bit natural, a little bit geometric. So I have little white dots on orange, and then this one is a grid, so it's more geometric, but it's also like heart flower-esque. So I feel like they coordinate, but they don't clash. So just keeping in mind with all the prints you might be using, think about scale of prints. How do they work together to keep it from being too overwhelming? Again, if you aren't doing legs, you don't need a leg fabric, or you can use the same fabric as you use for your wings for your legs. The geese without legs, in my opinion, sit a little bit better because they have the feet to kind of hold under their belly, but they do sit on their own no matter what. I engineered my pattern to be able to sit very easily on its own, whereas some of the other geese I've made with other patterns, I've bought several geese patterns from people before I decided to make my own. They did not sit very well, so they tended to lean over a lot. So mine pretty much sit up pretty easily just on their own as he falls over. The last fiber you'll need, I guess, is felt for the eyes. And you could use black fabric and zigzag or applique stitch around the eye, but it's so little. I do hand stitch the eyes on. This one is actually still just pinned. That's why you might be able to see a little white dot in the middle of the eye. So just a small piece of felt. This is enough to give me like at least 10 eyes. It's a lot. I love wool felt over acrylic felt. Like, acrylic felt is what most big box fabric stores sell, but you can get wool felt from Benzie and probably other places, but I've ordered exclusively from Busy for wool felt for 10 plus years. So I would highly recommend checking them out. They have smaller pieces you can buy. I think maybe the smallest is 9 by 12, maybe smaller. A couple other things you'll need is stuffing, definitely stuffing. And this is the bag that I have, and sorry it's upside down. Just going to do a quick pop. It's Fairfield brand. I got this at Joann Fabrics. Joann Fabrics is closing, maybe closed by the time you watch this. You just want a stuffing that is dense enough, because we really want the head and the neck to be dense in its stuffing, and then the belly and the body can be a little bit softer if you want, but that's what gives the neck structure and helps it. Because if you're making this for a child, I even grab them by the neck all the time. It's inevitable. So that you want that to be nice and stiff after it's been stuffed. I love a stuffing called Morning Glory is the brand, and it's called Cluster Stuff. It's very hard to find. But I actually don't use that for these because it's not stiff enough to have the neck. Like it is a really soft, plush feeling. It's great for stuffed animals, but unfortunately for these necks, I used it on a couple and I had to take it out and restuff them. You will need my pattern. So this is the pattern pieces. And then, of course, there's the whole written pattern, which has pictures for each step or most of the steps as you're making it, which you'll be seeing with these fabrics. So it correlates. Scissors, fabric scissors, and paper scissors, unless you're crazy and cut your paper with your fabric scissors. Tape is essential. And then there are some things that you can use if you are not used to sewing things like these. pins to hold your paper pieces onto your fabric is helpful. If you're more used to that and you want to cut out with a rotary cutter, and I will show you both options for cutting with a rotary cutter and cutting with scissors. You can use paperweights, which is really great. My friend gave those to me. They're lovely. Yeah, the last thing that you could do is, well, I guess we can get to that, is a ruler. Sometimes on pieces that have like a longer stretch, I'll use a ruler with a rotary cutter, or like the pieces for the foot or the leg, you can use a rotary cutter to help cut around those really straight. So we have all of our supplies. Of course, you'll need a sewing machine, thread. I usually use white thread. It works well with the geese. I use white thread even on the beak, and there's top stitching on the feet, so you don't really need to match that if you don't want to. It kind of blends in, so you don't really notice that it's white stitching. You could use orange on those. The only thing I color match is my eyes. I don't want any white stitching on the eyes, so I do use black thread to match the eye. Of course, your sewing machine and iron is great. Any small tools that you might use to help you sew are helpful. So the first thing that you're going to do once you have all your supplies together is pin, I guess, tape your pattern together and cut it out. So these pieces from this page all just get cut out. The foot, the two different beak pieces, they look very similar. They're different. You need to cut both out. And this is the little eye, and then the legs. If you're not making legs, you don't have to cut out the leg, or you can just measure the size of the leg with your ruler like that, and then cut out those rectangles with a ruler instead of cutting out that pattern piece. The wing is also on its own page. Cut that out. So when you're cutting out the pattern pieces, you just want to be consistent, but I usually leave the black line and cut around the black line. So the black line is pretty much fully intact, but you can cut directly on top of the black line in the center of it, or you can cut the black line off. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you stay consistent through all your pieces. And as you're cutting around curves, my best advice is just go slow, and if you have to stop and restart, put your scissor all the way to the back of the scissor where the paper, so you have a longer spot. As you're closing the scissors to cut, you're slowly turning the paper and the scissors together to get that nice smooth line, because I know it's actually tricky sometimes for people who aren't used to cutting with scissors to get a nice smooth cut line. And so just go slow. This is a good project to do sitting in front of a TV watching a TV show or listening to an audiobook so you don't get bored. And it's not tons of pieces, but you do want to be consistent with either keeping the full black line, cutting the black line completely off, or staying right in the center of the black line. So all of your pieces are equally reduced or equally the right size. And just keeping those lines smooth. You'll have more practice as you cut out your fabric to keep those lines smooth. The last thing you could do, I guess, as you're cutting out your pattern pieces, I have a separate rotary cutter for paper cutting, because I use for like FPP, foundation paper piecing, where you cut out paper pieces. And if you sew, foundation paper piecing is when you sew your fabric to a paper pattern and then you have to trim around it. So I have a separate rotary cutter for that, because paper dulls your blade a lot, which is why I suggested separate scissors. So you have 4 sheets for your goose body, and the head is one, and then there's dotted lines across each like cut section. So this dotted line is the same as this dotted line. So to align that, and this is great if you have a window or a light box, you want to lay those dotted lines directly on top of each other. So they're basically one disappears, and then you tape across where the paper meets, and you don't have to tape outside the lines of the goose, but that holds it together. So that's what you want to do for all of these pieces to make the goose body, is align all of those dotted lines directly on top of each other. And that will give you perfect placement and make sure that you have the right size goose. There will be some overlap on like this last piece, the butt piece, I guess I'm putting on here. There's like a solid 1.5 inch overlap. Some of the other overlap is just very small. But if you want to, as you fold this piece forward, so there's the whole goose. So if you fold like this piece forward, you could cut off this whole section back here, or you could tape it down, either way. Then you're going to cut out the goose itself, again, around the whole outer line, whatever you did for the other pieces, keeping the black line, cutting off the black line, or cutting right in the middle. You're going to cut down this curve, and you're going to cut up this dart, back down, and then around all where there's a solid black line. The other thing I was saying, if you're confident with your rotary cutter, is you can use your rotary cutter to cut your pattern out. And I don't know that I would do this in some of the tight curvy spaces, but in some of the longer areas, if you're confident, or you have a ruler, like sometimes I'll use a smaller ruler so I can kind of move. You can definitely use your rotary cutter to cut out the pattern piece. But remember, if you don't have two rotary cutters, having a paper blade would be great, because that paper will dull your blade. So if you want to save a little bit of time, I was first taught how to cut curves with a rotary cutter by Latifa Safir, I believe is how you say her name. And she has a lot of curve patterns. She taught the molehills at a Sotopia I was at, and it boggled my mind that you could cut curves with a rotary cutter, but I love it now. It's like great. So be careful. This is a 45 millimeter rotary cutter, but there's that smaller one too. I don't know the size, but it's a smaller circle, and that might be great for some of the littler curves, or you can just use scissors, like I said. So cut out all your pattern pieces. And then we're going to get working on cutting out our fabric. Okay, the eyes are the hardest for me to cut out. So we have all of our pieces cut out. You can set aside any of your paper cutting items now in the tape. You have your goose body, the wing, you have your foot piece, your leg, and the bottom beak, the top beak, and little itty bitty eye. The eye can be tricky to cut out. There is a fun trick you can do for cutting out the eye. Instead of cutting out this, print it or copy it onto freezer paper. and then freezer paper irons directly to felt. You can cut it out and then pull off the freezer paper. I'm pretty sure my friend Molly, Wild Olive, and Benzie both have a tutorial about that. But how I like to cut out the eye is I put it on my felt, and I actually do pin it, and I make sure that my pin doesn't go all the way over so I can cut around, and then I can take my pin out and hold it and cut that last little bit where the pin is. I'll show a close-up of that when I do that. So let's cut out the goose first. Okay, real quick, before we get any further, I did forget I read my own pattern. That's good, right? You do need SF101 to line the beaks. Now, it just adds a little extra stiffness. In the pattern, it does say you can either cut the beaks out of the fabric and cut the beaks out of the SF101 and iron them together, or like I did here, iron the SF101 to the back of the beak fabric and then cut them out at the same time. I find that a little bit easier. And then you also need batting for the wings. Now, both of these could be optional. Batting gives the wings a little bit of weight. It's in between the two layers, and I do like the way it looks. You could do it without batting. They'd just be a little bit floppier. And then the SF101 just gives the beak a little bit more stiffness, which it's not 100% needed. And if you did want some stiffness without wanting to buy SF101, because you need very little, you really could buy 1/8 of a yard if they'll sell you that much. Some stores won't because the beak pieces are so small. But if you didn't want to use SF101, you could just put an extra piece of fabric behind and then cut out your beaks from the main fabric and that extra piece of fabric, and then do like a basting stitch around the edge of the beak to hold the two pieces together. It's just to give it a little bit more thickness. So that's an option. You could do the same thing for the wing. So say you're not a quilter. If you're a quilter, I know you have batting scraps laying around. You don't need tons. You need 2 pieces, just a little bit bigger than the wing size. And if you don't have batting laying around, but you have extra fabric that you're not going to use, you could put a few pieces of fabric in there just to give it a little bit of extra thickness. Batting is just nice because it's a little bit lofty as well as it's soft. So extra layers of more fabric inside your wing would be a little bit stiffer, which is fine as well. But I would probably personally opt to leave the batting out if I didn't have any batting. Now, some fabric stores will sell batting by the yard, and you can buy just a little bit, like 1/4 of a yard should be plenty. Otherwise, buy the smallest bag of batting that you can find, which is probably a crib size. The goal with this pattern is not to make you buy a bunch of stuff that you're not going to use the rest of, so that's why I'm giving you some alternate options for those two interfacing. So I'm in the process of cutting everything out, so I'm going to walk you through that. I think we're going to switch viewpoints so you can have an overhead view. I've ironed all of my fabric, and I have, like I said, put the SF101, ironed it to the back of my beak fabric. You just need a small piece again. Now, there's one caveat, I guess, with the beak fabric, is this is pretty non-directional. I mean, it does end up having kind of a diagonal stripe with the dots, but I don't think you notice that. So I can put the beaks on there kind of in a pattern that they'll fit. If you have directional fabric, just make sure that your beaks are going in the same direction so that from the top and the bottom it looks the same. So the pattern pieces share, like if you need to cut one in reverse, well, it shall explain which that is, as well as the wing specifically has an arrow for your fabric direction. Okay, the one other thing that I want to talk about before we get going on the goose is if you want to make a patchwork goose. So this was the pattern that I worked with prior to making my own pattern, and definitely similar. I bought actually a handful of geese pattern after this one. The shop completely shut down, closed, couldn't find them anywhere. And they're all pretty much the same. So it does look very similar to my goose, but there's definite changes and differences. I wanted to make my goose pattern my own. I made this patchwork goose, and I just wanted to walk you through the process of if you want to make a patchwork section for your goose. Now, you could do the whole thing. I opted not to do the head. And so what I did is I took my HSTs and I laid them over the pattern, just laid them over top into a shape that fit the pattern that I use. And so if I'm laying squares over top of this, I'm going to try and maybe line up starting at the top of the neck. And then if I'm just going to maybe do checkerboard because that's fun. And we can just do like kind of yellow checkerboards with neutral colors. So I'm going to lay them over top of this goose pattern. And of course, you're going to make two, and you're going to make two mirror images of each other. So just kind of figuring out where the different fabrics are going to go. And you do have to take into account you have a seam allowance on these. So as you sew them, this is going to get smaller. So you're going to want to have a little bit wider than your piece, a little bit taller than the sections. And you definitely don't need as much fabric like in the neck area, right? So if you're going all the way up to the head, you can do just a small little section that comes up there and then it widens out where the body is. So that's how I did my pieced guy right here. I made a bunch of HSTs in about a size that I liked. I laid them out. And then the trick is to do a mirrored image of what you've done on your first one. Do exactly like lined up as a mirrored image. If you want to continue a checkerboard pattern around to the other side, make sure that things are going to line up. And mine isn't perfect in the middle, but you can see I've kind of got flying geese going up the middle. So just keep that in mind as you're making a mirrored image of your patchwork here. If you don't want to do up the full head with patchwork, stop wherever you think it's good, and then you can just cut a piece of fabric that's a little bit bigger than the head, sew it onto your patchwork piece, and then you're going to, after all the patchwork is ready to go, you're going to reverse this. Put the patchwork on the bottom, put your pattern piece on top of the patchwork, and cut out your body. So laying it out first can kind of help you decide, oh, I want to shift this down a little bit so as I sew it and I lose the seam allowance, that it's going to shrink up probably to about the right size. And then I know I need to add some there. So it's just kind of playing around with what will work and making sure it's just a little bit bigger so that you can cover all the area that you're going to need to cover. These, what I'm using here, are 3.5-inch squares. So just keep that in mind. If you want to do a similar patchwork look, that's a nice size square for it. Oops. So, and it'll feel kind of funny in some spots because you'll feel like you're kind of wasting fabric because like that little area, it barely covers the actual pattern, but as this shrinks up, you're going to need it. And then if for some reason you get to the point where everything's sewn up and it's still too small, just lay your pattern over your patchworked area and see where you need to add additional patchwork. Not a big deal. And then make a mirror image and sew up your goose, just like you would from the instructions. So it's kind of fun. I think I might actually make this goose because I think a yellow and white checkerboard goose would be kind of fun. And then again, what I'm going to do to this, what I did for this guy after I patchworked it, is I did iron on SF101. And I did that, and then I cut out the pattern piece. After I cut out the pattern piece from my patchwork fabric, I basically took my pattern piece. I'm not going to hold up the goose because it's underneath. And I just did about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I did a stay stitch all around the outside edge of my patchwork cutout goose to help kind of seal those seams where I cut across the seam so they don't pop open. Because I did end up having, on this guy, I did not do that. And I did end up having a couple seams pop, and I was able to work through it and stitch them up, and then it worked out. But in order to keep that from happening for you, I would recommend, once you have your goose cut out of your patchwork, to just do a quick stay stitch around the whole thing. You don't have to omit the spots where it's like leave open around the beak. Just make sure it's less than 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, so that when you sew it up, it doesn't hinder your seams at all. Yeah, so that's kind of fun. I was going to show you what the SF101 looks like. This is a roll. I just bought like 10 yards. It's very light. It's see-through. I can see the camera through it. So it's definitely lighter than quilting cotton, although maybe not some. And then I'm just going to bring it closer because it is like a woven texture. On one side, it feels and looks like cotton. Definitely see-through cotton. You can see my hand there. And the other side is it has like a grip to it, and it's shinier. It's probably really hard to see that on the camera. And that's what the side that you iron to the back side, the wrong side of your fabric. So I just wanted to show you what that was in case you've never used SF101. You can purchase it at Joann Fabrics if they're still around and they still have it in stock. I would assume that Hobby Lobby has it. Probably a lot of your local quilt shops will have it because a lot of people use that for bag projects. And then Wawak, probably saying that wrong, WAWAK.com is a great resource for notions, zippers, threads, inexpensive, ships quickly. I believe they're out of California. I've used them a handful of times. I just realized they have SF101. They also have a 60-inch wide SF101, whereas the typical SF101 and a lot of interfacings in the local fabric stores are 20 inches wide. So I'm going to try that next. I'm going to order a bolt. Not sponsored, just wanted to share that resource since Joann's has been a big resource for a lot of people in the United States. And if you're used to buying stuff there, that might be a new resource that you can check out. So I'm going to actually sew this up, and then I'll show you a quick peek at it after it's cut out, just so you can see what it looks like. Okay, I just finished piecing the patchwork that I did, and it's a little bit small, so I'm just trying to decide if I want to add like a half bits to the top and a couple to the bottom here, or if I want to scoot it down and add, probably this would be better, even though it feels wasteful here. If I did up there and here, I'd be adding to 2 sides, and I'd be adding 1 more square than if I just add to the bottom row. So just in case you thought that I knew fully what I was doing, you do need to, you know, test out the width. It definitely shrunk more than I was planning on it. So I'm going to add 1 more row of squares, and then I have to make a mirrored image. Just a quick little check-in. I have 2 of these guys done, so I'm going to cut out now and then do my stay stitching, and I'm going to cut out one at a time. After I cut out the one, I'll lay it on top of the other just to get all of the seams aligned perfectly. Okay, here we go. So I have one cut out. It has SF101 on the back, and it is stay stitched around the edge, just really close to the edge. So I actually cut out the goose first and then ironed it on, and this time I ironed it on first. And so what I will do is just flip this goose over and align all of the seams. I tried to iron them so they would nest, and I'll line it up so it will be a perfect mirrored image, and then cut this out, and then I'll just go over it with the iron and stay stitch the bottom piece so that it holds everything, like is fully ironed and it is in the same position, and then I can iron or start to sew this goose up. I think I'm going to do no wings on this goose, and I'm just going to do the feet option instead of the feet with the legs, so that we can see the option too. And there we go, they're all set. So I'll probably have this at the end of the video, or you'll see it on Instagram. Okay, so this is a bill or beak made with vinyl. So you can see the inside of the vinyl here. It's basically sewn, just top stitched, or sewn with wrong sides together, no seam. So I'm going to show you how to do that if you would prefer. Okay, so you have your vinyl, and we don't want to pin the vinyl because it will leave holes. So you're just going to have to hold it, or you could use clips, but clips sometimes can leave indentations. So I tend to just hand cut and hold, or use my rotary cutter. I just purchased this vinyl on Amazon. Or no, Etsy, I believe. And so I would recommend just wherever you get vinyl. This is just like a 1/4 of a yard. So this is a very awkward angle. Here we go. And then I will pick it up, make sure it's all aligned for that last bit. You're going to sew this into the goose the exact same way as a fabric beak. Just follow the same instructions. Just cutting it out and sewing the beak itself are slightly different. So I'm going to use a rotary cutter for this one. It's kind of nice if you do cut it out of the bigger piece, because then you can rotate it. I'm just going to trim. And with the vinyl, because you're not hiding these edges in the seam, you do want to make sure they're nice and crisp. So we have all of our pieces here, and so what we want to do is just pin them in place and cut them out. This is my magnetic pin bowl. It's great because the pins don't easily fall out, but you can see here it just says cut 1. The seam allowance is included on all of your pattern pieces. You can put in 1 or 2 pins. Sometimes 1 pin isn't enough to keep it from shifting. So to make it a little bit easier, I'm just going to cut these 2 apart real quick, just because it's a little bit more easy to maneuver. Something that I don't mind doing is using a ruler and a rotary cutter for these straight lines. But first I would cut out that curve around the bottom. The bottom here comes to a point. It's a very subtle point, but as you're cutting, that's good to try and remember. And so you could go and just cut this pretty easily with your scissors, or you can cut around that curve, and I'll do it on this one. You're going to have to take the pin out after. But this is our bottom beak, and we have SF101 on the back. If you cut the SF101 out separately from the fabric, just align them and then iron together after. Not a big deal. But keep the paper with the piece because they are slightly different sizes, and you want to know which size, which is which. So just doing the curves again, you can see maybe a closer look at my cutting out of my pattern. Not perfect, but trying to stay as easily to what I suggested outside of the black line as possible. Now that I have that, I can just pop that out. Cut, shift, and cut. I don't know that it's any faster, but if you're not used to cutting with scissors around shapes, it might be. So there's our bottom beak and top beak. Now, the other thing I wanted to address while I was cutting stuff out is why you cut your pattern pieces out before you cut out the fabric. So let's grab our legs and get that lined up. So depending on how thick, I guess our feet, not our legs yet. Depending on how thick this fabric is, you could cut all 4 pieces out at once. I would probably do 2 at once, just because more than 2 layers with a pattern like this can tend to shift the pattern a little bit wider. So I am folding my fabric over right sides together because we want 4 pieces. So typically with a foot pattern, it would be 2 regular, 2 reverse, but this pattern is the same in either direction. Like this side is the exact mirror image of that side. So you just cut out 4. So you could cut out, fold my fabric over again and cut out all 4 together, or just cut 2 and 2. I am putting fabric, since I'm folding it, I'm putting it right sides together because I just like having those 2 mirror images, even though this is already a mirrored image. Because it is a perfectly mirrored image, you could cut out 4 pieces of your fabric and lay them on top of each other and then do that. I also just use my rotary cutter without a ruler. If you're really confident in it, that works great. So just kind of cutting that away. You can see on this one, I did use 2 pins. And that's because this is a bigger piece, so it's easier for it to shift, and using 2 pins will hold it perfectly in place. So typically I like to fully cut it away from the fabric, but you do have to be careful because you can see the fabric is falling away. So you do have to kind of hold things or have it cut on the mat. And then as you're cutting, ideally, if you're right-handed, the left side of your scissor would be up against the pattern piece. That just gives you a little bit more control over how close you're cutting to the pattern. Like when I did this side, my opposite, and so you can't see as well. So I'd recommend do what I say, not what I do. Let's do that on this one. It is a struggle to remember that not everybody has made something like this before, especially if you're coming from a quilting background. So we've cut 2, and they're mirror images of each other, even though it is a mirror image pattern. So I just like to keep those right sides together, knowing that that's 1 foot. And then we'll put our next one up a little bit, and I'm going to just rotary across there. You can use a ruler. And then just pin in 2 spots. And this one, let me just cut it out. Part of the reason I didn't do this on the bottom one is because it just saves a little bit of fabric by not cutting it out. So what I would recommend is then go to the top cut here, cut down, and then just stay on that left side. If you're right-handed, if you're left-handed, you would be opposite of me. So the right side of your scissors would be against the pattern. And the scissors are kind of pulling up the fabric in the pattern piece, but you can see my hand over here is kind of holding it down so that they stay together, so that as my fabric doesn't pull too far away from my pattern piece, so that I cut an odd size, because that's definitely happened where my fabric has pulled far enough away from your pattern piece where you don't cut it properly, and then it's kind of a bummer. Okay, so now we have 4 feet cut out, which is awesome. I'm just, like I said, keeping them in pairs. Next, we can do legs. So this is an easy one to fold over in 4s. So I'm just going to fold it over like that, and then I'm going to fold it down because it's square, and I'm going to fully use my rotary cutter for this. If you don't have a rotary cutter, just pin this on and cut it out. If you have a rotary cutter though, this is a great way to do it. I'm just aligning my ruler so that it's fully covering that black line. And I'm just going to cut back over that little tail because I don't need it. And then shift it to the other 2 lines and cut them out. And I have much more fabric up here than the pattern calls for, just because I grab from my stash. So if you have smaller pieces to work with that are more the size the pattern calls for, you won't have all that extra. I do have 4 legs here though, just like my thing says. Like I said, this is optional, so you could omit that if you wanted. Okay, let's move on to our wings. So we are going to cut 4 of these, 2 in reverse. So this is essential because this is not a mirror image pattern. If I cut 4 in this exact direction, and then I tried to put right sides together, one would have the right side of the fabric inside out. And then this one has a directional for the fabric pattern, which may not matter too much on a fabric like this that I'm using, but it matters a little bit because we want all of our fabric to kind of go in the right direction. So what I'm going to do on this one is I'm just going to fold it in half as a mirror image, and then I'm going to cut out my wing twice. So I'm just going to make sure that the pattern, or the grain, I guess, which is the weave of the fabric, like how the actual threads go in the fabric, aligns with my arrow here. And that matters. That happens a lot in garment sewing. It doesn't happen as much with like fun sewing like a goose, but it is essential if your pattern, say, was goldfish. So if you're goldfish and you can see they're clearly in a direction, if you turn them this way, they look sideways. So you want your wing to be directional, so all those goldfish are going in the right direction. If you cut out your pattern like this, your goldfish would be going the wrong way. Even if you cut out your pattern like this, that when you turned your wing the correct way on the bird, on the goose, it would be kind of at an angle. So that is why the pattern has that angle, so that when you cut out your fabric, it's in the proper direction for where you're going to align it on the goose body. So this is one that while I'm doing this, because it's detailed, I would probably lay it on top there, do a loose cut to cut that piece out. So then I can take that piece, slide this piece down, make sure it stays aligned, and lay this right on top. The bigger the piece, the more pins I use, so the less I'm worried about shifting with multiple layers. If you're new to this, maybe just start with the 2 layers, or the 1 layer is fine as well, and cut all 4. But I'm all about time-saving hacks, so this is a good hack. Another thing that I will highly recommend, not sponsored, I love Kai scissors, Kai. I bought some at a quilt show, and These ones specifically, I bought 2 pair, and then I've since ordered more. It's my favorite brand of scissors, super sharp, super crisp. These I super love because they are super, I'm saying super a lot. They're very barely serrated. Like you can't tell unless you get really close. I can tell because I can hear it in the cut, and it just keeps the fabric from shifting so much as you're cutting. So I would highly recommend these, and you can order them online. But it is a little bit harder to cut through 4 layers. So just go slow if you're doing that. So here I'm going to cut it out because I would like to turn my fabric now so I can cut easier. So let's remove this fabric. We're done with that. And if I turn it, then I can continue cutting in that same manner because I'm right-handed, where the pattern is to the left of my scissors. I'm much more cognitive of that now because my son is left-handed. So before you are around somebody regularly who's the opposite handed as you don't realize how much the world is a right-handed world. Like he has special scissors, and I set the table for him opposite of what I set it for everybody else. I know it's not, proper etiquette, but he went to sit at the table once and everybody else was like, oh, the silverware is on the wrong side. He's like, no, it's not. And I'm like, that's because I set your table for you because you're left-handed. He's sweet. So, but yeah, if you are left-handed, you will be cutting with your pattern on the right side of the scissors because you'll have left-handed scissors, hopefully. So here are 4 pieces. Take the pins out and take the pattern off, and you can see as we pull the wings apart, and I have 2 sets because there's 2 more under here. They're going to be the same. That it's kind of like a mirror image of each other. So I'm going to keep those in sets because it's good. And then I want to take my batting. Now I don't cut my batting out yet, which is great. Makes it easier. Make sure that if there's any like little hairs or threads on there, you just can't see them through the fabric. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pair of the mirror image wings, having them right sides together. I'm going to pin them to the batting, just leaving some room around. This actually turned out to be a perfect size of scrap batting. It's roughly almost 10 inches tall. And then I'm just going to cut like that because I'm going to sew it like that. And then I'll trim the batting after I sew it. We're jumping ahead a little bit in the pattern. It does tell you this in the pattern. But for this one, I'm going to reverse it because it doesn't really matter how you add it to the batting either because the batting is non-directional. Just getting all these threads out. But I'm reversing the wing because then the batting ends up on the opposite side of each wing so that when you turn them right sides out, the batting is on opposite sides. It's kind of hard to explain until you turn it, and you'll be able to tell that one side is very smooth with the batting and then the other side has the seam allowance kind of turned in towards that side. And that's the side you want to face towards the goose. So having them be opposite like this will achieve that perfectly. So again, just leaving a little bit of room and they are ready to go. That is all we need the batting for. And then our last guy is our goose body. Just move, plus our eyes. So let's do the eye real quick first. So the eye is pinned to this felt, and I like to cut them out into a little square. And you can see my pin, the end of my pin doesn't go all the way to the edge of the paper, but this side it definitely sticks out. So I tend to start cutting somewhere on this side, just going slow and keeping that moving around so you don't have any jagged edges. And then once we get pretty much back to the pin, put your fingers holding it together take that pin out and then cut the rest of the way. And then take your thing off. So it's not going to be perfect. When I get something that's a little bit misshapen, I do a little bit of shaping after the fact. Just getting off some of those a little bit more oblong areas and try to get a nice circle. Like I said, the freezer paper technique is another great way to do that, but you just have to have freezer paper on hand. So again, I'm just going to put that in there, cut my little square. So you can see this piece of felt is 3 by 4 and I got 2. I have plenty more felt for more eyes there. If you have some sort of felt punch that does this, this is a 3/4, I believe. 3/4, actually I think it's like 5/8. Like a 5/8 inch circle, maybe 1/2 inch, somewhere in that range. Just in case you measure it, but somewhere in the 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch circle is what you could use if you have some sort of felt hole punch that would cut these out for you. That'd be kind of awesome, wouldn't it? I don't know if you can buy pre-cut felt circles. Maybe. I know you can buy like the little felt pom-poms or balls to make garlands. There's our second eye. Similar shape is good. Like this one is clearly a little bit bigger, but they're on opposite sides of the head. You don't really ever see them together. So I'm not really too concerned about that. So this doesn't have a direction on it, but I think it's pretty obvious that you want the fabric to be going in the same direction. So you could cut 2 out together. So we're going to take our fabric and we're going to fold it over, right sides together, and I'm going to lay our goose on top. So this is one of the reasons sometimes where I do the underside of the wing, like this guy, as the matching fabric, because we have this whole section up here of kind of wasted fabric, quote unquote. But you just cut that piece out, maybe put it in your scrap bin, use it for quilting or a smaller project. There's not much of a way around it because you do need to have 2 goose body pieces that are right sides together or in a mirror image of each other, one reverse. So I just like to put more pins on when it's a larger piece because things can definitely buckle. See, that even buckled a little bit, especially when it's curved cutting. Okay, so let's just turn this over here and just cut out. So just cut a little bit there. Again, I'm just trying to make sure with this hand that the fabric and the pattern stay as close together as possible as I'm cutting, because the scissor does pull up that fabric and it like separates the fabric from the pattern piece. And then being careful as I'm cutting these parts. So that's if you're cutting with scissors. If you want to cut with a rotary cutter, you don't have to as much hold it together, but I do like to hold my hand here just because it gives me guidance, I feel like, and we want the edge of that pattern to stay down, so we're cutting as close to it but not into it as possible. So that's how you could cut with a rotary cutter, but I would recommend being as precise with that as possible and only doing with the rotary cutter if you're super confident in your skills to cut like that. So I'm just going to turn it, and sometimes a rotary cutter is a little bit hard to get around curves. You do want to keep your blade as close to the paper as you can without cutting into the paper. So that's just to keep your pattern pieces all as precise as possible, because they are engineered to work together. And there is a bit of play in most areas, but the beak is the trickiest part, and you want to keep that as close as possible to the size, like cutout size, as you can, so that the beak will fit well. So if we take our body off and set it to the side, and then I open these up, you can see I have two, one and then one in reverse, or a mirror image. We've got all of our pieces cut out, so we can start working on sewing. Before you can sew the whole goose up, we have to do a couple things. So we do need to do the feet with the legs, the beak. We have the wings that I did have to unpin, and then we have the eyes. So you can place the eyes now if it's a little bit easier for you, or you could do it after the fact. This one I did after the fact. Well, it's not even done because they're just pinned in place. That allows you to adjust the eye placement a little bit. But if you use the pattern, if you're doing it prior to sewing the goose up, you can use the pattern and it will show you exactly where to place the eye. And you can do it two ways. If you have a light box or a window, you can put it underneath. You can place it kind of on top with a little pressure on it. It's like a little pressure on the eye with your finger underneath, and because you want to hold this in place and slide that out. Then you can stitch it there. You can, depending on if your fabric is kind of see-through, if you're using a whiter fabric, it probably is. You could lay it on top of the pattern, and usually you can see right through the pattern and place it over the eye. You could also just hold it up to a window or put it on a light box and see where that eye placement is. And then pin that in place. And then what I would do, because this needs to be reversed for the other side, is if you can't see it through the pattern well enough, which probably on this fabric I could, actually it disappears pretty well. I would just use a Sharpie or a black pin and circle around that eye, because you can see it through the paper, and then you can easily lay your other piece on top of it, aligning it with the pattern, and then you can lay it where it belongs as well. So we're going to stitch those on. Now you can do this by the machine. I really do not like to change thread on my machine. So I am just going to hand stitch it with a whip stitch, and I'll show you a close-up of that. Let's prep the other pieces first, and we'll go to the sewing machine, do all the stitching at once. So we still have on these two body pieces to add the wings, but we have to sew the wings first. Okay, so I am grabbing a fabric marker to mark the lines on the foot piece and the wing piece before they get sewn or pinned together, although my wings are already pinned together, so you'll have to change that. But for the foot piece, it has 3 lines on the bottom of the piece. So you could do, if you have a light box, put the pattern piece under the fabric and use your marker to just make those lines. And you only need to make those lines on 2 of the foot pieces. Otherwise, you can kind of fold it like I did, and then you can kind of fold them up a little bit as they're laying on top, and use your finger or a pin to mark where the top of that line is, and just use that fold guide to mark the line onto the fabric. This marker I'm using is removable with, I believe, heat, as well as it has an eraser end. It's a Marvy brand, and it's the one I use a lot. Sometimes I use pins to mark my lines, and sometimes I just wing it. pardon the pun, but it is a good time to mark those lines on the foot pieces. You can also do this when you're getting ready to sew them, but the wings I like to do before I pin if I'm going to mark them, because then they're pinned. And if you mark it after you've sewn the initial seam around the wing, it is a little bit trickier because the pattern has the seam allowance included. And once they're sewn and you turn it right side out, that seam allowance is gone. So just something to consider there. You can also use pins like I'm showing here. And I'm just doing the same thing with kind of the fold of the marker or of the pattern, or if you have the pattern underneath, and then you put a pin where that line is. And that works too, but I would wait to do that till right before you're actually sewing up those lines. So these are the marks on the wings that use top stitch, and that's after you seam it and then turn it. Those top stitch lines on both the wing and the foot are just meant to add a little extra detail. So you can mark those with a fabric marker, but just make sure to test your fabric marker that it easily comes off, especially your wing fabric, because that's usually a little bit more visible than on the foot fabric, which is probably a little bit darker because it's orange. Okay, I'll be honest with you, I had to recut my wings because this is what they would have looked like in opposite, and that's not correct. I want them to look like this. So I had to figure out how to do that. So don't use a stripe like this. It's tricky. If a stripe's going vertical or horizontal, easy. If it's on the diagonal, because of the way you want it to like lay and mirror, I had to do one upside down. So that was interesting. But my wings are all pinned like I did before, just on top of the batting, mirrored like this. So we're going to sew around and then cut the batting off. So those are ready to go. To do the legs and the feet, before we sew the foot piece together, we want to sew a leg to the top of each of the foot pieces, and then we will sew the foot pieces together. So let's just get all of those aligned. 1/4 of an inch on those, and then the bottom and the top beak just go face to face. We're going to sew down one side and then kind of pivot it over and sew up the other side, and it'll kind of this is the bottom, so the top, because it's bigger, will kind of bow up. So that's kind of set. We don't really need to do much for that, and we can go and get these sewn up at the sewing machine, and then we'll come back once the wings are done and the eyes are sewn in place. Let's take this with us too. Once we have the eyes sewn onto the body and the wings completely sewn, we can come back and place the wing using this pattern piece over here. Okay, so we have our goose eye ready to go, and a needle with black thread. I just have it doubled up and then knotted at the end. I'm going to start in the back, and I'm going to push my needle through. This is hard with the black on black, but I kind of use my finger as a guide, just like a 1/16 inch in from the edge of the felt. And then I'm going to pull my needle back through to the back, like putting it right on the edge, if not slightly below the felt edge, into the back. And I like to catch on the back, so I'm pulling it all the way through. I like to catch my knot just for extra stability. Sometimes that knot has a tendency to pop through the fabric layers. So I catch my knot like that. And then I just stitch all around the eye like that. It's basically a whip stitch, but I'm trying to keep the stitches even on the front, like even as in straight. And then on the back, they'll kind of be angled because I go in directly across from it on the edge, but then I come up down a stitch length away. So that the angled stitches on the back. It doesn't really matter because if you're using black thread with black felt, you don't really see those stitches, and it is kind of hard to see. It is kind of hard to see on the back still, but once I get a few more stitches in, I'll I'll show you the back more. And I just like to try and keep those stitches as even as possible on the front. It just looks a little bit nicer. But again, black on black is so difficult to see that as long as you're just securing it, you will be fine. And it is very hard to see how many stitches there are. But I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 so far. And I don't know why my tendency is to go over to the side of the camera more. So I'd probably have at least 20 stitches on this. At this point, I can definitely take out my needle. And I would say these stitches are not going to be as even as I like them because it's kind of hard to do this with the camera in between me and my stitching. The biggest thing to think about placement for your eye, if you're not following the guide, is to keep it out of the realm of the seam allowance here, which is about 1/4 of an inch. So at least 1/2 inch from the edge of the beak area is ideal. Okay, so there's the back, so you can kind of see the angle. It's not perfect. Some of my other eyes that I've done are much cleaner. And then I just grab the fabric, not the felt, but just the body fabric in the middle of the eye pretty much, and just do a couple little knots to tie off that thread, and then clip my thread. Usually I do 3. It's just like what I was taught. So then just clip it. Then you have an eye on your goose. Okay, we are at my sewing machine. I've got my pile of items to sew. First is our beak. So we have the bottom beak, which is the smaller piece on the bottom, and the top beak on the top. So I'm just going to line one side, point at the bottom to side of the top, and the curve should be pretty on par. I'm going to start at the top, and I'm going to give a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am going to back stitch at the top. I'm just going to follow that around. When I get to the bottom middle where that point or very subtle point is, I'm going to stop. I'm going to lift up my foot, and I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to pull this piece so it reaches the other side or aligns with the other side. Let's move in for a touch here. Okay, so I pivoted my foot from that position, so it's going to align with the side. And then I'm going to lift up this bottom piece and align it with the edge of the top piece on this side. So it will bow a little bit here, and that's what we want. And then I'm going to stitch up and around that side, back stitching over the edge so it looks like this. And then what you want to do is you want to clip those curves. Let's see if we can get it to focus. Here we go, focus here. There we go, that's fine. So we want to clip those curves, not fully to the seam, but pretty close, within a 1/16 of an inch. That's going to help that curve ease when we turn it, because any fabric on a curve is going to stretch or convex, and you want it to fold over itself when it's not stretched, and when it's stretched you want it to have some give to pull apart. So now we're just going to turn this right side out. And smooth that line. If you want to, you can iron this flat, pushing out everything so that seam is nice and crisp. Sometimes if the point doesn't pop out, I like to use something pointy. And again, we can kind of see how the top, if the bottom is flat, the top kind of bows up. That's what we want. Now we want to top stitch around this in the same manner we sewed the seam, but we are doing a top stitch just a 1/16 inch to an 1/8 inch from the edge. And I am going to raise my stitch length because it looks a little bit nicer when it's bigger. Let's go in here. And I am going to still back stitch, but I want to make sure I keep that back stitch within the first 1/8 of an inch. So just maybe like 2 stitches back and forth. And then carefully following that curve, you can see how the edge is just barely under the foot here. And when we get to the point, we're going to probably do the same thing where we do our needle down and we pivot. And then we want to adjust this because remember the top here is more fabric. So we want to make sure this edge is nice and crisp. And just come back around here. Back stitching again. Oops, sorry for the little bump. And now we have a nice finished beak with our nice little lipped edge that will give it some structure. So you can set that aside. Okay, so if you're sewing the cloth beak, you're going to sew it right sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you're going to turn it and you're going to stitch that little ridge. So because we're sewing these wrong sides together, it's basically the same motion where you sew down to the point and then you have to put the needle down and then pivot this over so you get a little bit of a bow to the top beak. But I like to make sure I have a little bit bigger stitch since it's a top stitch, and I do a slightly larger than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Still do a back stitch. Try to make sure it's within your seam allowance where you'll sew it into the goose body. And yeah, just a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch seam allowance because we want to have the same size as the cloth one after we do the ridge to fit into the pattern. So once you get to the middle where you keep your needle down and you pivot the foot just like the cloth one I shared, then you're going to pull the fabric over and continue on this side, back stitch. And then what I like to do, because these can be a little uneven, is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to just trim everything down to be the same size. And that will give you to about exactly a 1/4 of an inch overlap. Just so that both the top and bottom are trimmed equally. So you have a nice smooth edge. And then when you're sewing this into the goose head, you're just going to fold those towards the bottom of the beak, towards the bottom of the goose. Instead of the ridge, you have this like exposed seam basically. But that's how you sew up if you wanted to use vinyl for the goose beak. Next we have our wings. And if you remember, our wing is like this, but I'm going to actually take one of these off. I have 2. And remember, they're mirror images because I want to add a tag. Sewing the tag on, if you want to put a tag on your creature, your goose, I guess, it's great to put it under the wing because then you can hide it. Like this part of the wing will be up against the goose body. This is the outside of the wing. So it will hide nice under there and it won't stick out or anything. So just so you know that the fabric that is on the side of the batting is going to be the fabric that is facing up when the wing, or out when the wing is on the goose. The fabric that is on the top is going to be the fabric that's facing the side of the goose. So when you put on your tag, if you do that, make sure it's on the side that is going to face the goose. And I have these ribbon tags. I just align it towards the top and I fold over one edge, sew across. You'll kind of see. Oops. I went a little bit farther. I want to stop right before the end of the ribbon. I'm going to turn it, but before I go all the way down, I'm going to fold up the bottom. I just cut it off a little bit because these are longer, so I can put them in like a seam and they stick out. But there's not a great place to do that on the goose, so I like to tuck them under the wing. You might have any other type of tag. It's just a kind of a fun little place to put a little hidden gem. You could even do like a little hidden heart or something there, or like a little special thing for whoever you are sewing for. So I have my little tag on, and then I'm gonna re-pin this down. So the tag is on the right side of the fabric, and it's on the top piece facing the bottom piece. To sew the wing, we have the wing pattern piece here, and the reason I brought that over is because there's a little spot that says leave open between these lines. You can mark that with a little fabric marker. You could technically mark it with a little pencil, or just leaving it on the back side in the seam allowance, or just like a pin. And that's where we're going to sew to and from. So we are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we have the batting, it is helpful to have a 1/4 inch foot, or to be able to tell about how much a 1/4 inch is. Since I have my foot where I want it, I'm going to take my pin out so I don't actually hit it. And I'm going to do a couple stitches, and then I'm going to do a back stitch, because we do want to back stitch at the beginning and end of pretty much every single seam we do on the goose. And then I'm going to follow the curve, just slowly turning as I'm stitching. I like to do a similar stitch length to what I do quilts with, which is about 2 to 2.2. I'm going to stop when I'm about a 1/4 inch away from this line, right around where that divot is. But you can't quite see it under there, but it's the same type of divot as right here. And then I'm going to do another needle down, foot up, pivot, and go back to following the curve around that. Same thing at this divot. Stop when you're about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And it's okay if it's a little bit off. This is just kind of guesstimating. Now this curve is a little bit trickier, so let's scoot in there a little bit, because it's a full curve around to this side. So it's going to be hard to smoothly turn that fabric. So at some points I like to keep my needle down, pivot a little bit, not too much, because I don't want it to be not a smooth line, but we do need to kind of help us get around this curve. So I just lift with my needle down every few stitches, every 2 or 3 stitches, to get around that full curve. And you may have to do that up here at this one too. Once you get mostly there, you can just continue all the way up. And then this curve, probably about the same. It starts to get to where if I'm turning, but I just can't turn enough. So just pivot a little bit. Every so often as it makes sense. And then sew back down to this needle. Take the needle out before you get there. Do a back stitch. And you have your wing with an opening where we're going to turn it. But we have some stuff to do before we're going to turn it. Okay, you can take out your other 2 pins, 3 pins, whatever you used. And next we're going to trim all of the batting. Now it doesn't have to be perfect. You could actually trim it with like zigzag scissors. And if you cut a little bit of the fabric, that's fine. We've already got our 1/4 inch seam allowance. But those zigzag scissors, I have heard, do the same thing kind of as clipping. I'll show you a section on my next one. And now before you turn it, you do want to clip those curves. The same thing you did on the beak around each of these little things, and you 100%, even if you use zigzag scissors, want to clip up in that little ditch, not fully to the seam line, but close, because that is going to pull a lot when we turn it. I'm clipping every about 1/2 inch, and you can determine if that works for you or if you need to do more. Sometimes some fabric is more stretchy. Anywhere there's curves, so pretty much around this whole curve, you just want a little bit of give to that fabric. I would not recommend skipping this step. I have another pattern where I've had friends skip when they've been testing for me. They're like, oh, it was way better when I didn't skip that step. Okay, so all clipped, all trimmed. So now you want to turn it, and you're going to grab in between the 2 pieces of printed fabric. The batting stays on the back, and you're going to pull kind of the fabric through that hole, and the batting is going to stay with one side of the fabric, so it ends up on the inside. And then just use your finger. You need to use like a pencil, a blunt pencil, or a dowel to potentially smooth out any of these curves. Make sure my iron is on, because I do like to iron this part. And pull out the other side. Use my fingers to kind of smooth it. So there is your almost finished wing. We do have to stitch up that opening. So you can see we do have a little bit of a pull there, but because maybe I didn't clip one spot good enough, but that'll iron out, I think. You can see this is the piece that was on the top that we had this tag attached to, and this is the piece that was underneath that with the batting right next to. And so we want it to be on this side because the seam allowance on the inside turned towards this side with the tag. So you'll feel it when you make it, but there's a little bubble here around the edge where all the seams converge. So we want that to be on the back side for our wing to be nice and smooth. So I just have a tiny little iron set up here next to my sewing machine, but I just kind of like to iron it flat, and that helps even out all those seams. And then I do hand stitch this closed, just turning it under 1/4 inch. And I do a ladder stitch. It's almost like a whip stitch, but it's like an invisible stitch to sew that up. The other way, if you didn't know how to do that you could do is you could fold it under and then do a top stitch all around the outside edge of the wing, and that would stitch that closed as well. This is just my preference to close it in this manner. So I have just the same thing like when I sewed on the eye, just a needle with white thread. It's threaded through and both sides are knotted in one end. And I am just going to insert that from the inside up to the edge of my opening. And then I like to figure out how to do the same thing. Come back in on a little edge and grab the tail to hold that knot in place. I just find that that knot is so little that it feeds through the fabric too often. So then I can bury that knot inside. And then I just fold under around 1/4 inch, just trying to keep that nice curve smooth. And every time I stitch on one side, I'm going to go straight across and put the next stitch directly across from it on the other side. I don't know if ladder stitch is the exact terminology, but that's what I tend to call it. Some people call it a whip stitch, but I find the whip stitch is more angled, like what I was doing with the eye, what I do with the eye. So that just gives a really nice finish where it looks super similar to just a regular sewing machine stitch. And then I like to put my needle in, and I do like to get one knot in there really close together so that it's like so it's a really tight knot. Being careful not to have those little tails that I can't get rid of. It's really hard. And then I like to thread my needle through, I'm trying to grab that little loop there, and then bring it up somewhere else so that I can clip my thread off over here. And we have a nice smooth close. So I'm going to do this to the other wing. Okay, so I have my second wing sewn up. And then if you want to use, these are actually a scallop scissor. Okay, here's my zigzag scissor. I was like, that's funny. Okay, so if you want to use the zigzag scissor instead of doing the cutting, you could do that. I'd probably like skip the part where it's like the opening, just because I want that seam allowance to be as big as possible. But otherwise, you can kind of cut in because your seam allowance is already there, but you just don't want to cut super close to the seam. And I am always going to want to cut those divots still, so we'll do that next with the regular scissors. This is supposed to work the same as doing all those slits. I tried it one other time. It was fine. I don't know that it was better because I don't feel like I'm any faster at this. These scissors are harder to use and I'm not used to them. But it's good to try new things, right? I still want you to, though, cut up into those little divots, not cutting the stitches themselves, but enough so that there will be less pulling in those. And then we're going to turn it. Same thing. I almost sewed this all the way up when I was sewing around because I forgot to put the pins in for my little leave open area, but I caught myself in time. So everything turn out and we'll take a look at what it looks like and we'll move on. Okay, I did iron it real quick off screen, but this is my second wing and I think it did pretty fine for the zigzag thing. These are my two wings. I still have to stitch this up, but we're going to move on and I will do that later. Okay, so we have a wing here and I completely forgot to film the stitching up of these stitch lines. So I had to sew up a new wing. So you'll see at the end of the video that goose does not actually have the stitch lines. So what I'm actually doing, because it's hard to get, you can't see through at this point, and I didn't mark the lines prior, so I'm just lifting up to kind of note where the end of the stitch line is and put a pin there. Okay, once you have your pins in place, you can take away your pattern and you're just kind of gonna, you can go straight from the little ditch up to the pin. You can kind of swoop it so it looks like the angle of the wing, like the curve of the wing kind of comes up, which is what I'm going to choose to do since I didn't do lines. Just when you get to the pin, take the pin out, come over here, kind of do the same thing. So now you have a wing with some stitch lines similar to the pattern. So it just adds a little extra detail. Okay, we have the foot and leg pieces. We have 4 of them. And with right sides together, I'm going to sew each leg piece to each foot piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I want to do a back stitch at the beginning and end of that. Just like that. Now I'm just going to sew the rest of these. I am still going to back stitch, but I'm not going to cut my thread. Essentially, I'm going to chain piece. And I just want to make sure that is nice and even with the top. Once those are done, you can just clip them apart. And we want to press the leg piece up, but we want to press the seam allowance down. And press the seam allowance down because usually this fabric is lighter than the foot fabric, and you will see that seam line through if you don't press it down. So I'm going to press those down real quick. Okay, they are all pressed down, so they're nice and flat. Now we're just going to put 2 pieces together and align all the edges. The most important alignment is those seams, that they are lined up nice and smooth so that our orange goes around properly and there's no like adjustment. And then you're going to start at the top, do a 1/4 inch seam allowance with a back stitch all the way down. When you get to this first angled part, you are going to needle down, pivot, and then when you get to the needle position being about a 1/4 inch away from the curve, you're going to needle down and pivot that as well. And the curve you do want to be careful of, because it's a larger piece of fabric and it's a decent curve. It could shift with those bias edges. Bias just means when it's cut at an angle to the grain or it's cut on the curve to the grain, it has a tendency to want to open up and flare. Back up, don't forget the pivot points, and don't forget to back stitch at the top. I'm going to do one more and then we'll get to turning them. Okay, so I have 2 done and I clipped the curves. You see the clips, and then I chopped off kind of at this point over here. I kind of flattened that out instead of having it stick out, just to reduce bulk in that seam. So just like that, clip around the curve. So the closer your clips are together, and then chop that off, the easier it'll ease around a curve. The farther apart, the less. And then I do want to kind of clip in this little divot too, just so there's less bulk where it'll fold over itself easily. And then you are just going to turn them right side out through the top opening, just like we did the wings. Push it through. It does help if you have a longer tool for some of these items. I like to use, because this is always just handy, it just kind of pushes out, and then I can actually use this tool to like smooth out the curve into the corner as well. I think that might have been my iron. And then I'm going to press that. So I'm going to turn the other one, and then we're going to work on putting a little bit of stuffing in the foot and doing the toe stitches like this. That's what these lines are, is those toe stitches. Okay, so we do need to stitch these lines onto the foot. That gives it the webbed appearance. You could stitch this by hand. I stitched by machine. You can see here, maybe, the lines. I can see them, but there's a line there, a line up the middle, and a line here from my fabric marker that supposedly will erase, but also you'll see, because you're stitching directly on top of that line, and then it's filled with stuffing, so it kind of indents it. So you probably won't even see it if it still remains. You can also take your pattern, and it's a little bit different after you've sewn it, because you have to take into account the seam allowance. You can kind of put a pin, let me get a straight pin, that one was a little curved, in, and I would put it facing the toe and only go through the top layer, because you do have to stuff it, and do that one and then do this one. Doesn't have to be exact, it's just kind of, you know, a basic idea of where it is. You don't have to be perfect. And then in the middle, you can just fold it to get that middle one and put a pin in the middle. And this is why marking it is a little bit easier, because you do need to do these pins before you stuff it, and then the pins being in there. But we're going to stuff just a little bit of stuffing in each. And you could use a dowel or something longer to get the stuffing down there. We don't want tons, and we want it to be rather flat still when it's stuffed. So it's just kind of a little bit of a process to get that in there. You just kind of got to work with it. I'm pushing it down towards the end, being careful of the pins, but I want this to be rather flat. So I'm going to kind of smoosh the fluff out. I'm only filling this bottom foot area. And just kind of working the stuffing around. So it's pretty flat. It's maybe a little bit fuller than I'd like. So now I'm going to stitch these lines. Basically, I'm going to start at the top, middle, do a back stitch, go straight up, back stitch, and then start down here. And I want to keep that seam as flat as possible. When I first put it under the seam is as flat as possible, and you're going to just kind of flatten out as you sew. You definitely want to get those first few stitches in and keep it as flat as possible, and then it will go over some of the stuffing. When you start to get to that pin, you want to take the pin out if you have a pin, and just go up about to where you think you should, or if you've marked it, and then you have your first little webbing stitch. Cut off those little clips, and then you're going to do the same thing, starting over here and going straight up. You don't want to touch them. You want to stop your stitch before you get to that one. It shouldn't end up on the same, but flattening that end out and getting it under there as flat as possible. And keeping it as flat as possible. You're definitely going to go through some stuffing, back stitching at the end, and you've got your second webbing. That one got a little bit wonky there, but I think that's okay. And then our last one, the other side, and then trying to end it about the same place so it's pretty even as the first one. So there's our webbing for our first foot. Now you want to make sure that the top of your foot is facing up when you're sewing, because there's a lot more, at least with my machine, where I'm like cutting the little things, and I have sometimes these little nests that you want that to be on the back. So make sure the top of your foot that you want to be the top of your foot is facing up. And then I do like to add a little bit more stuffing to fill it up to the leg, but I usually tend to leave the leg empty because that gets in the way of it sitting flatter. So I put a little bit more stuffing in just to fill the rest of this leg up. If I'm adding the leg to the foot, I want to stuff the full foot, but leave the leg more empty. The stuffing can reach up into there a little bit. If I'm omitting the leg from the foot and just having the feet no leg, which is great too, you would not sew the leg onto the foot, and you would sew up the foot, two pieces together the exact same way, just ending at the top of the foot without the leg. You would still stuff it, do the stitching, and then I would only stuff the foot up to about this angled spot, and I would leave this section empty of stuffing so that when you sew it into the goose body, this part is flat, which is essentially what the leg is doing, so that the body of the goose can kind of sit on there. When you add stuffing to this part, it bumps the body of the goose up, and it doesn't allow it to be as flat sitting properly. And then so when you just do the foot without the leg, leave this straight section empty of stuffing. So we're going to do this foot the exact same way. You're just going to follow the lines if you've drawn lines on. And again, this is drawn with a fabric marker that has an erasable option. Sometimes they're erasable through water. They come with an eraser with it. Whatever option you have, use that. And if you want to eyeball it, you can do that too. I got really good at eyeballing mine when I was making my pattern because I made so many of them and they all turned out fine. So I probably put in about 2 little clumps of stuffing, ping pong ball size maybe, smaller than a golf ball, little clumps, and not dense by any means. So I just want it to be flatter. And then I can see my line here. It's between my thumbs. I'm sure it's harder for you to see. And I'm going to do the same thing. Just back stitching, trying to stand that line. I'm just trying to keep everything flat and even. There we go. And I want my seam lines to be like these seam lines to stay as flat and even as possible. It's always great to go around and clip all your little threads, and on the back too, but I just wanted to show that you can't really even see. I haven't erased those drawn fabric marker lines, and you can't even really see them. And then don't forget, just to make sure that you add that little extra bit of stuffing so that your feet are nicely stuffed equally. And they look pretty much the same. So there are your two feet plus legs, unless you omitted the legs and you just have the feet. You sew everything exactly the same unless you're omitting the legs, and then you just don't attach this leg piece. That is the only difference. So we have all of our components pretty much ready to go. Feet and beak. We have wings. So I'm going to put the goose body on top of the pattern piece here, and then I can see the outline of the wing through the pattern piece, and I'm going to put my wing on my body piece inside that wing outline, and I am going to then pin the wing to the body piece, probably just 2 pins, and then I'm going to stitch the wing to the body piece just around this top curve, like from there to there. And it shows that on the pattern piece, it's a little bit bigger because the wing now has no seam allowance, but basically that same amount of space around the curve is where you want to stitch the wing on. That allows it to hang properly on the body. To get the second side on, because our pattern placement is backwards, you can do the same thing that you did before, where you turn the pattern piece over, and because you can see that outline, you just draw, and you don't have to draw the whole thing, but just some of the main parts to make sure you're getting that wing in the right spot. And you can put this on top of it. And again, if you have a light box or a window, and then I can align this using those markers so it's in the right spot. Another way that you can do it is, I do this sometimes, you can have your piece that works with the pattern piece, align that, and then take your wing and put it right sides together with this wing. So this is the back of the second wing. This is the front of the second wing. You want the front to face the front. So we're going to lay it on top, and then I'm going to lay this on top with right side facing down. Just align the pattern pieces. You can pin it just in like one spot, sometimes 2. Don't go all the way through this, just grab it, and then you can flip it over because it's pinned, and pin it from the top. And then you take out those pins on the back. That way it's in the exact same position on both, because sometimes you will get it a little bit astray from one side to the next. And again, just gonna stitch just around that curve on the top section on both of them. And then we are going to, after we do that, we can pretty much assemble. But for now, you're gonna go to your machine and we're gonna stitch these wings on just around the top curve. Okay, we're over at the machine. I just wanted to show you one wing stitching on. I am doing a top stitch, so I want to have a tiny bit bigger stitch. I'm going to start just down from the curve. My goose is upside down right now. I do a back stitch. I am just maybe a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the wing. And I'm doing the same thing as when I sewed the wing. If I need to lift up and pivot, we've got a few thicker layers, so you just got to keep that in mind. And when I get around the top of that curve, I do come down maybe 1/2 inch to an inch farther than the front, so that just the angle as it's being held, it hangs nicely. Then you can take out the pins. And as I hold up this goose, see the angle of that wing droops nicely and hangs properly. It doesn't like fall in a wrong way. And when I do the other one, this is where the tag will be underneath. We're going to place the geese right sides together. And you can pin it if you want, but we're going to sew down all the way around until we get to this little leave open between lines. We're going to do a back stitch there and a back stitch here and sew all the way between. We're going to sew from this other line over to here, back stitch it at both ends, and then we're going to sew all the way up here to the beak opening and back stitch at both ends. And then we'll be ready to attach the beak. After we attach the beak, we can add the feet and do the dart, which the feet go in the dart, and then we can turn it and stuff it, and we're done. So we're pretty close. The rest of it is pretty simple. All right, we're back at the sewing machine, and we are going to sew from the beak opening down this edge, back stitch at the beginning and the end, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, and then we're going to go to the other side of this is called a dart and back stitch. And we're only going to sew to the beginning of our opening. I'm going to realign that. Back stitch. And then we're going to go to the other side of our opening. Back stitch. Taking out pins as we go. If you have to lift and pivot around that booty, the tail feathers, I guess, definitely do that. This head curve is really important to keep smooth because it is what the shape of the head ends up being. So try to be extra careful about smoothness around there and back stitch at the beginning. So now it's all sewn up. We have to clip all these curves. So the curves that went before it's turned on the outside are less important, but clipping them reduces that bulk. The clips that are kind of like a convex before are the most important because that is going to pull there when it's turned inside out more than this type of curve. is going to tuck in. So we want it to be able to fold in on itself, which is what those clippings do. So if you want to do this on more of a flat surface, you can essentially keep your scissors in the same spot and just kind of move your fabric into a new spot. It works really well most of the time. That's often what I'll do with a bigger piece is I'll go over to my cutting mat and I'll just keep my scissors in the same spot and I will move my fabric. It's a little bit easier because moving the scissors, you have to be careful every time to not clip through your seams. Whereas when you're moving the fabric, you have a little bit more control to do that quicker. But either way you do it, just enjoy. It's all part of the process. Is good to enjoy. You notice I'm not really clipping down these straight parts because it's not really necessary. It's just the curved parts. Kind of skip over that. Definitely around this little booty curve. Kind of skip down there, come back to this curve. Okay, so we clipped all around that, and now we're going to do the beak. We're going to attach the beak. Okay, so we have our goose body and we have our beak. Before we sew them, we want to align by pulling it apart and align the top seam and the bottom seam to find the middles of the side. You can use a pin and just pin it in there for now, or you can, why is my pin not going in? Or you can do a little like mark with a pencil or a fabric marker. I would prefer it be in the seam allowance. Do it on the other side too, just realigning that those middle seams, finding the center of the side. Pins are tricky because they do poke, but so I do recommend if you're new to this, just put a little tick mark there with a pencil. So then we're going to take our beak with the top at the top and the bottom at the bottom. Remember the top has the bow in it and like it's taller. So then we're going to insert it into this opening. So you notice our opening still, we're on the wrong side of our goose body. And then the beak is right side facing out. So we're inserting it into this opening so that the right sides of the beak and the right sides of the goose body are aligned, are facing each other. And then we're going to pin the top point of the top beak aligned with that middle seam on the top and the bottom point on the bottom beak aligned with the seam on the bottom. You are going to probably want to just scooch those seams over to the side. We do just want to be careful when we're sewing over them that we are smoothing out any gathers because we don't want to catch any extra fabric in that seam. You're going to go to the side. So right now, the top of our goose head is here and this is the neck. So the bottom is going this way. We take that seam. Remember, we have that little lip from the seam we did, and we want to face that little lip towards the bottom of the goose. So you're going to angle that down, that little lip down, and align with that seam with your pin that you marked the middle or your little mark. Turn it over to the other side. So now our top of our head is here and the bottom or the neck is here. So we want to push that seam on that side towards the bottom, which is going this way now, and align it right there with our pin again. So what we want to make sure after we've pinned these is that each section can smooth out pretty easily. It might take a little bit of stretching because we are on like kind of a strange angle with an angle and a curve, but we want to make sure that there's no big gaps. If for some reason you had a larger gap on the goose side, just kind of take this out and make your seams a little bit smaller leading up to the opening, and that should do it. If your beak is bigger, you can take out the seam of the stitch on the side of the beak and make it a little bit bigger, and that should decrease the size of the beak. So now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch around this circle 1/4 inch. And it's a little bit tricky because it's such a small space, but I'll walk you through it. And I like to sew on the inside of the beak. So I'm going to take the inside of my beak, and it doesn't matter where you start. I like kind of to start in one of these open areas between the pins. And I'm going to put my foot down. So I have 1/4 inch seam allowance and put my needle down. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Let's see. We are going to start with a back stitch, always for stuff like this. That just strengthens our seams. We are going to come to the point, which is where this first seam is. And I can see now I probably should have pinned it like this. So as I'm pulling the pins out, it's a lot easier. So just when you get to, as you get to this bottom seam, just make sure the seam is flat so you don't have any bunching. When you get to that point and that seam, you do kind of want to do the same pivot and lift and kind of pivot the body to the other side, making sure that all of your edges around your beak and your goose body stay even. And then we're going to sew, oops, one of our pins fell out up here. So let's just pop that back in so we don't have any issues with alignment. So we're going to sew up and past our first side seam. We just want to make sure that that seam is facing the bottom of the goose. And if you can, take the pin out once you get there, or go slow if you can't. I'm just continuing to turn it over to make sure that my edges are staying aligned. We want to make sure we continue that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that we don't have any issue with grabbing both fabrics. We're going to come to the point on the top, and we're going to stop, and we're going to pivot there as well. And then again, just checking that my fabrics are aligned, everything's smooth, and continuing and doing the same thing on the other side. And you can see it's very small, this little circle. My hands are in the way, but as long as you're going slow and you're pivoting and you're keeping those pins in until you absolutely need to take them out, everything should stay aligned. When you get back to the beginning, you will backstitch, and let's back up. You will have a beak sewn into your goose body. So here's a little something to look out for. I like to check to make sure it caught all my fabric on both sides, but this is just also something, it's a little bit wobbly here. It goes kind of, wow. So I'm just gonna go over that again to smooth it out and flip it the other way just so I can see it nicely. Not a big deal, and you probably won't tell from the outside, but just smoothing it out. If I end up having to take out a few stitches on the outside, I will, but I don't know that I will. I think it will smooth out nicely. My main concern is that we grab all of the fabric from both sides, and there's a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. You could turn this right side out now and check it, but I think as long as you're grabbing all the fabric and it's smooth, you'll be okay. The next thing we need to do is put our feet in the dart, and then we can turn it and stuff it. So you have your 2 feet, and you just want to make sure which side is the top of both. Oops, I'm sorry if I bumped you a little bit there. Just clipping those strings that I didn't clip before. So what I like to do for the feet is stitch them closed across the top at about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch, at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. just like that. It helps keep it flat. You can keep them together or clip them apart. I tend to clip them apart. So now we're going to insert them. Okay, so we have our goose body and we have this dart. So if the pieces are aligned, it looks like this. What we want to do is pull the pieces apart so it opens the dart up. And essentially, we are going to sew that dart by aligning the seams, and sew straight across from this side to the middle and then straight across to the other fold. But we want to insert our feet in there before we sew it up. So we want to take our feet and we want to point the top or the front of our foot. We want to be facing away from us. So this is the belly, this is the bottom, and this is the tail down here. So we're going to be pointing the front of the foot towards that direction. The back bottom of the foot comes in this direction on both of them. Insert them both in there. You can go up through this hole too if you want. And then we're basically just aligning with this corner, the first foot, and it should pretty much reach to the middle seam. And then we're aligning all of those layers and pinning it in place. Man, I need to get rid of a bunch of these angled pins. I'm battling the sun here. It is almost gone and it is shining bright into my sewing room right where I'm sewing. So I hope that's not blowing anything out. And then the other side, tucking this edge of the leg into that corner. And it should go just about to the middle, if not perfectly. And pinning all of those layers. So we have the front of the goose with that seam in the middle. We have the leg seams in the middle. And then we have the bottom of the goose with this seam in the middle. We are going to sew from here all the way across to there, making sure your seams are going in opposite directions to reduce bulk, and that everything is staying straight and aligned, which you'll put your hand through into the opening on the bottom to kind of angle anything if it comes out of alignment. And what you want to make sure you do, let's get closer, is we want to start over that fold, this fold on this side. You can see it here, but it's on the other side. You want to start and backstitch over the edge of this fold and that fold. So when you're starting, you're going to backstitch over that edge a little bit. And you can go, I would do one long seam first, stitching everything together, and then you could go back over it to secure the legs a little bit better. Legs tend to be pulled a little bit. Once you get to the middle, you might have to pivot because one of those parts of the dart is definitely more angled than the other. So we just want to make sure that everything is staying aligned. We might have to fiddle with the edge of our leg a little bit because we want everything to get caught with a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you want to go back over that seam a couple times, if you're giving this to a child, because those legs can be tugged on, what I like to double check, just like the beak, is that I caught all layers with a nice seam allowance so I don't have to worry about any raw edges sticking through. That one's pretty close. So I'm actually going to take a few stitches out here right in the middle and pull that little bit of leg up a little bit higher because it makes me a little nervous how close it is to the raw edge there. So I just pulled a few stitches out. Should be able to open that a little bit, tuck this up just a touch and re-stitch, always doing a back stitch over that middle section. So then I have all the layers a little bit better. It comes up higher. I'm happy with that. That looks good. So everything is stitched up. You can double check all around your seams, but it's time to turn it. Okay, so we just backed up a touch. I'm gonna grab my feet and kind of pull them through the bottom opening, and then you can kind of start to zhuzh through the rest. The wings will probably come pretty quickly after. Oh, look, you can see the tag on the back of a wing. And then to get the neck through without too much scrunching, I like to pop my fingers up the neck and kind of guide it down until I can grab it with my two fingers. I can pinch the beak, and then I can pull everything through to have a nice goose. See when we pull it through how the nice, the lip angles down to give it a nice feel. And I can pull the tail up, just making sure all of the seams are pulled out. Okay, so I am back. It's day 2. I have changed clothes. So we have completely sewn up our goose and pulled it right side out. So we're going to stuff it. So the goal here is to put some stuffing in through the hole you turned it and get as much up into the neck and the beak and the head. And we want those to be pretty tightly stuffed. Sometimes a dowel will help. I was just looking for my ruler that I used yesterday. It is that long skinny ruler and it's missing. So I'm going to angle you maybe a little bit down towards the goose so we can see how I get the stuffing up and into the goose body. Okay, that should work. So I just start by putting a few handfuls in through the opening on the bottom. And then when I start to get some in there, I'm going to put my hand in. You want that hole to be big enough for your hand. So I then start to shove it up into the neck. And you want to get kind of a big chunk up into the head first. So just kind of keep pushing until you get all of it up in there. It will kind of wrinkle your neck a little bit, but it ends up being fine, and you can iron it a little bit after it's fully stuffed. Steam it, I guess. So I put about 3 handfuls in there, and then I'm kind of scooching the neck down, and I'm getting it, and I'm putting my fingers are like right here, because I want to push that as much into the beak to fill the beak as much as I can, because we don't want to have like air pockets in the beak. So I'm going to still need some more stuffing up once you get it in. Sometimes you might need this to kind of push it in more. I was able to get my hands up in there. I made this pattern so the neck is a nicer size so that it's just like, I feel like the proportions are better. So there's another big clump. And then we're going to do that same process over again, just pushing bits up until we get a lot of that stuffing up into the top. It's a little bit of a wrestling act. Here we go. Start to get up there. So this is where I might need the dowel a little bit, or just pull some of that stuffing back out, because I definitely want to push as much up into this head part as I can. And that will help fill out any like wrinkles or anything. Unfortunately, you do just need the head and the beak to be firmly packed. And so I've got it firmly packed. So now I'm just going to start to fill the neck area, doing the same thing. And I just want the neck up until about where it starts to widen a bit. I want the neck to be pretty firm because that's the support that holds the neck up. And we'll keep it from flopping when kids or adults grab it by the neck. We'll keep it, the stuffing from separating the firmer it is. And one of the reasons I like this a little bit stiffer stuffing, it's just kind of a wrestling act until you can get down to the body. Firm, but not like lumpy. That feels pretty good. Something to consider if you have a serger is, and this is going to be a child's toy, is to serge those seams on the inside because they get a lot of stress from the stuffing up there. So once you get about to this point, you've got a pretty sturdy neck. I still want it to be a little bit dense here, but you can kind of have a lighter fluff after this for the body. You still want it to be firm, but it can definitely be like not nearly as packed in there as I was doing for that. And at this point, it's kind of more just filling the whole body section with stuffing and then continuing to stuff it until you get the right firmness that you want. Making sure you get a nice bit up and maybe using your dowel a little bit into that tail portion so it pops out the tail feathers a little bit right there, because you don't want that to be empty, so to speak, either. I just keep my big bag of stuffing between my legs. It's kind of the easiest spot for me. Then as you're doing the body and the belly area, it's just kind of like the firmness that you like, but making sure you're filling it out. Like, we definitely want to add some more here because we don't want that neck to flop. So just kind of pushing more stuffing up there to pack it in. And then we start to lose that flap. Yeah, a little bit more up there. Probably having a sewing machine in my way is not the best option here because it's nice to have the space to let it kind of flatten out. Okay, that's pretty good. Might try and just do a little bit more. Yeah. Okay, for me that's good. At this point I am going to pin up this spot on the bottom, the opening. I am just going to kind of have, how can I do this? Have the fabric fold over 1/4 of an inch and pin it into place. And then I'm going to ladder stitch that close just like I did for the wings opening. I always pin this because having it pinned, even if you have to adjust a few things, is just helpful for keeping them closer and not pulling as you're stitching. Just like that. So let me figure out a new viewpoint for you guys to watch me stitch this closed. So I just have it with the head underneath, like in between my legs. I just have a needle with thread, and just like I did the wings, I just kind of start by going in with my needle, and I kind of go into a space that doesn't need to be closed and come back down so I can grab that knot. And I just grab it by going in between the two threads and then pull that all tight so the knot's hidden underneath. And then I can come up and just kind of right in the crease where the seam would be is where I'm going to sew it. And you can just double check as you're going along that you have a good 1/4 inch seam allowance there so that you have enough seam allowance on the inside in case of wear and tear. Okay, so I just wanted to share stitching the eyes on after you have finished the body. If you didn't want to sew them on prior to sewing up the body. So this is how I did the geese before I made my own pattern. So I would just kind of pick where I wanted the eyes in and look at it straight on like the camera shows to make sure that they're level. And then I would kind of look at it from the top to make sure they kind of line up at least enough. The nice thing is you don't really ever see the eyes at the same time. So if they're slightly off, you're not going to know. And I would just hold them there with a pin. The nice thing about that is that you can adjust it so you can get a little bit different look with the different placement of the eyes. So like if I had the eye up here, it looks a little bit different than if you put the eye down here. Or you can put the eye back a little bit or up here a little bit. So there's a little bit more play with the way it looks, and you can get a different view, like vibe for the goose. I think I'm going to move this one up a tiny bit. So it's kind of fun to play around with it. I like it, but it is a little bit trickier to sew it on. So what I do is it's just, again, my regular needle, black thread. I tie my threads together at the end with a knot, and I'm going to just pull that knot into the middle underneath the eye and grab my knot again because I want to not see that knot. And then I'm going to pull my needle out to the edge of the eye. And it's the exact same stitch where I'm doing a whip stitch, but a straight like ladder whip stitch. I'm just doing it when it's stuffed. So you do have to be a little bit more pliable. Let's move you in. So out from the edge on the goose fabric into the eye, and then I'm going to rock it up to the outside again. And just going around the whole eye in that same manner. After a couple stitches, you can take the pin out. Definitely using pressure from your fingers. You're going to have to maneuver the body a little bit to get your needle to come out in the right position. And I'd rather have my needle come up from underneath the eye instead of having to have it come out too far on the goose fabric to makes like a little extra stitch out there. You can't see. It's a little bit harder to do my needle from this side, but for the sake of you all, I want to get all the way around and show you how I transfer to the other eye. sure I grab that fabric. I stabbed myself a little bit. The trick with this is kind of going around the eye and making nice straight stitches, which is hard to do. So once I get back to the beginning, my last stitch, I'm going to stick my needle through all the way to the other side. So you're going to have to scrunch the head a little bit. You might have to play with where the needle comes out. Definitely a longer needle is good for this. There, so it comes out on the other side. In the eye is ideal. And then pull that last stitch taut on this side, and then you can sew up the same way over here. Let's kind of angle you down so you can see this a little bit better. Kind of twisting the goose as needed too to access different parts of the eye. Sorry, it's my sewing machine. Well, that was not a fun sound. So I'm just going to rotate it back around this way. So yeah, just kind of rotating your goose as you need to get the right angle for how you're stitching is really how you do that. Probably not the way I did it for the first eye, but whatever works for you is the goal. So once I've completed the stitches on this side, I'm actually going to pull my needle up onto this other side, and then I can kind of tuck under, grab some of the goose's fabric instead of the eye, and try and do a little knot just underneath the edge of the eye. And then I can pull that knot tight, and then I'm going to bury the thread again to the other side, and then I can cut it so that I don't have any tails coming off the eye. Everything's buried, and I have a nice goose eyes there for you sewn on. So that's a different way you can do the eyes. This goose was my first rendition where I got my actual shape properly drafted on my pattern. So I didn't do wings because I was just trying to quickly go through, but then I made wings to make sure the shape of the wings would work. So these haven't been stitched on, and I think I'm going to do maybe like an X with some decorative like floss or thicker thread just to add these on, because this will just be a decor item for me. I do have my tag there. I like to tuck it on the bottom of the wings, and this wing is fun because it has the contrast underneath. But that's a kind of a fun little thing you could do with some hand stitching. And if it's not a gift for a child, if it's going to be played with a lot, I would definitely recommend just to machine stitch this on. And then the last thing is, let me grab a different one. Okay, so this is one of my first renditions of my own pattern, and it didn't work out. His belly was a little bit too chubby, and the shape of the wing was okay, but I wanted something different, and the tail ended up being too long and didn't come up enough. So you can see I definitely shortened, and then the tail comes up higher. But I wanted to show this because I have a little patch on the bum here, and if you want to add any embellishments to your goose, do that before you sew the two goose body pieces to each other. You want to topically sew on. On a lot of the geese I've made, I've put like a little heart on the bum. So if you want to do anything like that, you could put something up here. Do that before you sew the two body pieces together. Once you do that, it becomes harder to sew stuff on, like you saw with the eyes. And you could sew something on like this. Sorry, I'm talking too loud and quick. You could sew something like this on by hand, but I find patches are a little bit harder to sew in by hand, so doing it by machine. Or if you choose to have like a fabric heart, just raw edges, applique or applique stitch around it, that will look really cute too. So just keep that in mind for when you're wanting to embellish your goose, to try and do it before you sew the two goose body pieces together. Okay, here is our finished goose. So if you have some wrinklies in the neck area, just shoot it with steam or an iron. Those will work out. As we kind of look at the goose from all angles, you can see how the wings fall, and we have a nice little logo ribbon. If you're doing these, you are definitely welcome to sell these on a small scale. The bottom, the legs, don't forget, if you didn't do the legs, this is what it will look like with the little feet hanging off there, and it sits very much the same. So yeah, I hope you had fun making the goose pattern, and I hope you'll share what you've made with us.